But there's also another dimension, a theory of liberation, which I think accounts for the immense importance and excitement that this theory has generated in the last century. And you can start really from the same point. It's that human beings are what they are because of the way they make their lives, the way they produce the means to live, and they produce the means to live as a society, as a group, not individually. So in a way, we could look at them just as another gregarious animal like ants or bees. But what differentiates them from ants or bees, Marx holds, is that human beings have this capacity to reflect on and change the way that they work on nature to produce the means to life. In other words, labor in the human sense, in Marx's view, incorporates this idea of reflection. And that means that they can change the way that they interact with nature over time. And that is the dimension that's properly human. That means that over time, they can get greater and greater control, greater and greater capacity to take from nature what they need and to produce the means to human life. Now, this just doesn't just mean that they aren't monotonously stocked like a certain animal species in the same way of doing things all the time, but over history they actually get better. They actually realize this capacity to control nature to a greater and greater degree. In that sense, already we can see they become freer. That is, with the increase of technology, with their understanding of nature, with their capacity to reorganize their lives, human beings become more and more capable of controlling the way in which they interact with nature.
And is part of the point here that man in his most primitive state, when he's literally emerging from the animal state, is virtually enslaved by nature. He's subject to all the natural forces around him.
The realm of necessity is the word that Marx uses for this very much.
And that the historical process can be seen as the process of self-liberation from this enslavement to nature, which is, conversely, if you like, the process of the conquest of nature, that we are more and more mastering our material environment. That is the...
What I call the liberation theory is really this, that what human beings are about in history comes to be something very surprising. The motivation for all these earlier stages of history, moving from one system to another, is, of course, just acquiring the means to life. I mean, the very dire necessity of keeping alive. But Marx had the view that it was part, if you like, of human fulfillment to exercise this capacity to control their lives for its own sake. As it were, that there was an expressive dimension, not simply an instrumental dimension to this.
It becomes a form of self-realization.
Self-realization.
Yes.
And it's this dimension of self-realization which is utterly frustrated by class society. In other words, you see Marx constantly saying in his works both early and late is that in class society, capitalism for instance, we have a society which at best simply produces in order to keep men alive. It's just the bare means, production is simply a means to keep alive, whereas man as a laboring animal ought to be capable of expressing himself in his labor as a human being. There's almost the vision of man as a collective man, social man as a kind of artist, expressing himself, which is what awaits human beings once they can overcome this alienation. Because these two sides of the theory, the explanatory theory and the liberation theory, don't always fit too well together.
I mean, can you show how they don't fit together?
By an example. I mean, if you want to look at Marxism simply as, in an almost Newtonian sense, scientific theory explaining human history, doing for development history what Newton did for the planets, then you get a view of inexorable law which governs human beings at any period of time, as Newton's laws of the planets govern the planet's motions at any period of time. Then what disappears is something in the liberation theory of Marxism, which is something of this kind, that as we make the revolution from capitalism to communism, we recover control over certain facets of our lives, which previously under capitalism are, as it were, under the control of inexorable law. The idea that at one point in history, some things are controlled by laws, which then are recuperated, if you like, for freedom. This is an idea that doesn't fit neatly into a model of Newtonian science.
In other words, I mean, what Marx is suggesting is that up to a certain point in history, namely the Communist Revolution, all historical events are covered by laws which have the character of scientific laws, and suddenly there's going to be some kind of break, so that man will after that become free, and therefore not governed
Well, except
by
the liberation theory
laws.
wouldn't be that crude. I mean, it would be of this kind, really, that as the different societies succeed each other in history, I mean, feudalism, capitalism, and so on, you get very different kinds of laws governing people, and things that are under control at one period cease to be at other periods, and vice versa. And it's only with the arrival of communism that we get another such change, but at this point a change which has an unprecedented degree, incorporates an unprecedented degree of control. But the idea would be that there would be quite a great qualitative differences between the kind of laws applying under ancient society, feudal society, and communist society. Against this, however, you have the way that Marxism came to be considered, quite understandably, in late Victorian period, the period of Darwin, the period of, you might say, scientism as a kind of ideology, when it's seen as an inexorable set of laws. Now, within Marxism itself, these two sides have gone on struggling. You know, as a political movement, it can't abandon either one, because I think its political punch precisely depends on holding on to both of them. I mean, it has to hold on to the liberation theory because that is the whole messianic future that it can open to man, and it has to hold on to the claim to being a science because that stamps it as something quintessentially modern, which has overcome superstition and which can have a really solid foundation. But that's the level of politics. Any Marxist theoretician has been in one way or another deeply embarrassed with this, and they've taken different roads. Yes. But I think it's undoubtedly true that anyway, as Marx developed, he came to see the firmness and rigorousness of his science of capital as being absolutely on all fours with that of physics.
And do you think that
just
claim
can't
can be
sustained?
upheld?
No.
It can't.
But I don't think it can be sustained in principle for any theory which purports to deal with human beings, their motivation, their history, their society, how they develop. That kind of rigor, that kind of exactitude, that kind of verification just can't be.
Of course, I think one ought to add, in fairness to Marx, that the notion of what constitutes science has changed radically in the 100 years since he wrote, that all well-informed men in the middle of the 19th century thought that scientific knowledge was a specially secure and certain and infallible and incorrigible kind of knowledge. Yes. Whereas now, that view has been virtually universally abandoned, and we realize that science is fallible, science is corrigible, and therefore, I mean, Marx himself would take a different view now if he were writing.
Certainly, because he would have different models.
Yes.
And that too wouldn't fit very well with, as you say, the messianic side. It really was a 19th century belief. Darwinism cleaned up this area, and we had that all clear, and physics had cleaned up this area, and now Marx was, as it were, cleaning up finally the area of human social history.